Greetings all, BWS2K here again with another video. It's been a while, I know. I've got a little bit of a background going here, but it's waving because it's also kind of record heat here, and I'm up on the second floor, so I've got a fan over there. I apologize for a little bit of the white noise going on. I want to ask you a question, and I have a visual aid. How do you play this game? It's a good question. Now, this is actually something that Mrs. BW and I bought. It was really kind of our first purchase together as a married couple. We were running through the store. I didn't have clothes packed for our honeymoon, totally spaced it. I had wedding things on my mind. And so literally after we got married and left, like the stuff was on the back of our car and we had the just married, we pulled into the Walmart parking lot. And there were some folks on bikes who were like, "Oh, you just got married. When'd you get married?" And we were like, 20 minutes ago. So we did a mad dash for clothes before we headed up north to go on our actual honeymoon. And that was one of the purchases we made. And it's actually, and you may have noticed the knobs here on the side, it actually opens up. And inside are a bunch of different components to play different games. Even the board can be used on either side. So you have some dice in there. There's a deck of cards, and then of course you can play checkers and chess, those kinds of things. The normal basic things. It's 10 games in one, and I imagine that with a deck of cards you could probably make that stretch for a lot. That question of how do you play this game? That question is the Cortex Prime answer. A lot of folks from the last video and still in the Discord, because new folks are arriving every day, they want to know what is the basic rules of Cortex, or what is the basic character sheet. And there isn't a solid answer because Cortex Prime is so much like that 10-in-1 chess, checkers, poker, dice, crazy eights game, backgammon. It's lots of components. You won't use all of the components, but some of the components you will use in more than one iteration or manifestation. The answer is really dependent on the table. You have to know, like as the GM, you are the one able to answer that question. It's not a generic question or a vanilla question that has an answer. The way you might say, how do you play tic-tac-toe, or how do you play poker, or how do you play checkers? It's modular. There's sets that you'll use and mods that you use, and then sets that you won't and mods that you won't. And some mods might be used for more than one game. The checkerboard can be used for checkers, but it can also be used for chess. So it's at first a simple answer, and yet underlying it is a complexity that's just not always easy to convey to folks. So that being said, the question then arrives, and actually has been on my mind for a long time, other than that other video I made, the basics of Cortex, where the basics are really just choosing dice, rolling, selecting a total and an effect, and comparing to opposition, which even that there's wiggle room. It's been a question on my mind. What's the best way to explain this question better, or explain this answer better? And I don't have a good solution, but there was the Creator Confab earlier this summer, and I was a part of it. And so I have what I created, and I would like to try to go through it together and explain why I made the decisions I made, as opposed to maybe other decisions, or how I made some changes. I introduced some new rules, or I don't know, they're almost like mini rules. But I have some things there, so it might make sense to go through what I made and explain why I chose what I chose. It's very much in the playtesting phase, so it's not even a final version, and it's been through a lot of changes over time. Compared to my original one, it's very, very different. So that's the process we're going to go through. And then in a sort of asterisk, for a long time I was trying with some new video editing software to get some fancy transitions and do all that stuff. If you've been watching for a while, that's kind of been on my wish list. I tried, I gave it my best. It just wasn't clicking. So we're back to doing what we used to do, which I don't know that we ever stopped doing, because I have a lot of videos I never ended up posting. So we're going to have a fancy transition, and then we're going to be set up differently so that we can walk through the document together. All right, Here we go. Fancy transition. Okay, here we go. So the confab started in June. It's still ongoing. The playtesting phases are still ongoing, but there was a theme this time, and Melly chose weather as the theme. So all of the entries, well, it wasn't like required, but like that was kind of the idea, was that all of the entries, all of the submissions would use weather as a theme, and there were actually sub themes, additional like themes that you could include kind of as a bonus. So all of the entries were amazing. I was just wowed with everything that came down the pike. There's some really creative folks out there. This was my entry. It's called High Pressure. And I'm not gonna read everything in the document. It's only like 6 pages, I think, but I'm not gonna read everything, but I will read enough to be able to inform some of those decisions and things. So it starts with a little bit of the pitch. High Pressure is a setting for Cortex Prime set on Earth 1,000 years from now. Climate change has greatly intensified weather patterns, and most of humanity that has survived has done so in isolated communities throughout the globe. Life in the settlements, which often feature rudimentary technology at best, is fraught with peril. That's where people with extraordinary weather-themed abilities, called casters, step in. While they do have normal lives as a vital part of their own communities, they also serve, when needed, as convoy guards, search and rescue parties, delivery service, settlement security, and much more. So that was kind of my pitch for the setting. And then we get into a little bit more Cortex-y, a little bit more GM-y related mechanics-y things, but not too heavy. The world of High Pressure is one which simply cannot be described comprehensively. Extreme weather phenomena aside, which itself may approach the incredible at times, there are also dangerous flora and fauna that have adapted to the new planetary conditions. Nomadic clans roam the wilds and prey on the unprepared. The onset of uniquely gifted individuals with special abilities may have been recent in your campaign, or something that occurred hundreds of years ago. And not all of them are friendly. Technology levels themselves vary wildly from place to place. Much of the setting is intentionally left to each table to create, define, and explore on their own. Originally, this section was much larger, and through sharing and getting feedback, it was too wordy in the ways it didn't need to be wordy, and it was not wordy enough in the ways that I really wanted to accent. So this is where we've kind of landed with that as kind of a bit of an introduction, and there's another paragraph which we'll read, and then we'll start talking sets and mods. So as such, with that idea of intentionally leaving each table to create, define, and explore on their own, as such, players are encouraged to be proactive in world building and establishing truths about the planet around them. Most of the time, this will just mean inventive roleplay and table agreement. There may be times, however, when a player wants to actively challenge or introduce something. This can be done through plot point expenditure. For a single plot point, a player may rewrite a current scene distinction in some minor way. So if there's a scene distinction of poisonous toxic rain, it becomes poisonous toxic fog or corrosive rain, etc. That's up to the player to choose, right? For 2 plot points, a player may create their own scene distinction or establish a fact or truth about the setting that hasn't already been provided. So they might say, nomads in the Southern Isles use steam power, or this particular kind of fruit only grows in the moonlight, etc. So before we even get to the section on mods and sets and things, I'm already showing how it's going to be different probably from other games you've played. Namely, one of the key components is players have an active ability to shape the world around them and define it. So as the GM, you don't need to come in with a super detailed plan of everything. You can just kind of wing it in a lot of instances. And that was kind of part of my design philosophy. As I've mentioned before, I like to run games on Friday nights in the Discord, and sometimes the prep work for that is just something I don't have a lot of time for. So I wanted something that was able to be sort of picked up and played with minimal. There's still some pieces that have to happen, but with minimal requirement, minimal load on a GM to come up with an entire adventure. I wanted to leave some of that opportunity up to the players to be able to kind of, they have a really neat idea of something they want to happen. As a GM, I don't need to sit back and do stats for everything. We can just, okay, yeah, that's cool. How do we want to handle that? So that's a good question moving forward. All right, so we get to this next section, and I have it broken up into prime sets, which are the sets that you're almost always going to be rolling if you're trying to do something. And those are attributes, distinctions, and roles. And then we have non-prime sets, which may not always be included in a role if you're trying to do something, and these are abilities and signature assets. Those page numbers there are in the Cortex Prime Gamer Handbook. For growing, like for instead of XP, instead of milestones, we have session records, which you've seen if you've watched some of the more recent, like the last Sentinel Man videos where I actually was keeping track. That's session records, keeping track of each session and then using them for plot points, whatever. There's a page reference there, but you'll know what I'm talking about if you're familiar with the videos. And then for the mods that we're using, we have the Doom pools and the Crisis pools, and then we also have Stress, which is a mod, and the Pushing Stress, which is also a mod, sort of a sub-mod of Stress. And then these are the new rules. I have players can spend a plot point to change stress received to a type of their choice at the time it is received. So this is actually something that's in Marvel Heroic that is not a normal rule in Cortex Prime, which is when you receive stress, you can spend a plot point and change it. So if I'm getting attacked and that's coming in as physical stress, and I might say, well, I don't want to take it as physical stress because my physical stress is already kind of high, but I'm doing okay with my mental stress, so maybe I get punched and it confuses me. I'm a little bit dazed, so I'm going to actually spend a plot point and take that stress as mental stress instead of physical stress. So that's something that you can do in high pressure. Players can spend plot points to alter or create scene distinctions or establish truths about the world. We already read that section. Failing, this is another one, failing a test against the crisis pool results in receiving D6 stress. So what that means is if you're the first time you fail in a test against the crisis pool, you receive D6 stress. If that happens again, you receive D6 stress again, but that's going to step up the D6 you have to a D8. Or if you spend the plot point, the D6 is going to go somewhere else, right? You see how this goes. And then the last piece is that plot points can be spent as soon as they are earned, which is not the rule in Cortex Prime as far as I know. It's definitely not the rule in Marvel Heroic, but at my tables, the moment you have a plot point in hand, you can spend it and use it. That's just the table rule I have. It keeps things simple, and it makes it a little bit easier in terms of planning ahead and stuff. As soon as you hinder yourself on a distinction or whatever, you've got a plot point, you can spend it. Go for it. So why did I choose attributes? Well, I chose attributes because I wanted something that was innate to every character, and I actually used the list from the book. If we scroll down a little bit, we have create 3 distinctions for your character, and then I said one must be a background, one must be related to their occupation, and then one must be like a catchphrase or a motto. So a little bit of guidance on the distinctions, and they all have that hinder SFX, which is the, you can take it as a D8, or you can take it as a D4 and give yourself a plot point if that distinction is working against you in some way. So you've got your 3 distinctions like normal. But then assign dice to your character's attributes. I went with just what the book has, because sort of in this phase of playtesting and stuff, I don't know that I can come up with I don't want to spend a lot of time coming up with an alliteration of attributes. An alliteration of attributes. I just did it. Because I want to see what works. Like, will these work? And these are just kind of one of the default lists offered in the book. Agility, alertness, intelligence, strength, vitality, and willpower. And those cover a good set, a good array for what I expect characters to mostly be getting involved in terms of how things would be affected and impacted. So that's what I wanted. I wanted something that was innate to the characters, that if all else fails, what are the things in the my prime sets are what are the things, if all else fails, if they can't use their abilities, if they're at the bottom of a well and they don't have their equipment or anything, they still have their attributes. Same it goes for roles. So if we scroll up a little bit, I can show you again. So we have distinctions and attributes and roles. So the roles, I have a list that I provided, a 1d10, a 1d8, and a 1d6. So I'm a 1d10 farmer, I'm a 1d8 healer, I'm a 1d6 whatever. Like you set it up that way. And again, it's representing a skill set, right? So rather than having an exhaustive list of skills, I thought, again, keeping it simple, what's your role? and then that role kind of encompasses a large set of skills and abilities already itself. So the 3 prime sets are, in my mind, the 3 things that are going to be sort of innate and possessed by every character under every circumstance. Okay. As for the non-prime sets, the abilities and signature assets, we can talk about those. So signature assets are things that will help your character in some way. They may have 1 rated at a D10, or they can choose 2 rated at D8 each, or 3 rated at D6 each. So it really, I wanted the signature asset to be something, to be an opportunity for people to kind of come up with really neat, creative pieces of equipment, or if there's a relationship that really factors a lot into what you're doing, like, you know, depending on the session, depending on what's planned, you might have a signature asset of, like, you know, the best friend of someone in the party, or you're related to the mayor of the settlement or something like that, which may prove to be useful enough to have a trait, useful enough to have a die rating assigned to it. So you can have 1 that's really good, you can have 2 that are pretty good, or you can have 3 that are good to cover whatever situations you need. But you'll still only be rolling 1 from that set when you build your pool. So even if you have 3 D6s, 1 might be your surfboard, 1 might be your solar still, and 1 might be your colored pencils. You're still only going to be rolling 1 of those signature assets when you're building your pool, right? Okay. Abilities. So this is my spice. This is the frosting on the cake. This is the thing that is neat and the crux of, like, the pitch of what casters are going to be doing usually revolve around this. So you create a weather themed ability for your character and you rate it at a D8. This ability should be understood as something control, representing your character's influence over a particular area of the meteorological spectrum. And then page 52 has some guidelines about what levels of the ratings might kind of sort of mean, ballpark. The ability has, so the ability that you choose might be rain control, it might be wind control, it's open, and there's some suggestions later, but unlike the list of roles, which is a set list, ability can be anything you can think of. Of course, it's meteorological spectrum, so, like, it's weather related, but you pick. And it's going to automatically have 2 SFX. It's going to have an effortless SFX, which is something that the player writes. It's the player defines it. Excuse me. I'll have a drink of my Marvel mug. And that SFX is spend a plot point to perform some minor specific application of your ability automatically without needing a roll chosen at character creation. So if you have rain control, you might choose for your effortless SFX that you can create a small localized rainstorm over the size of a city block that lasts for 5 minutes. And whatever you're doing, if that's the thing you want to do, you do not need to roll your pool. You can just spend a plot point and do that. Now, obviously, there's some maybe discourse that needs to be involved with the GM, but largely it's just an opportunity to come up with some really cool application that your character is probably just so used to doing. It's the usual way they use their ability that there's no reason to even assign a role to it. So that will kind of guide perhaps their decisions or inform their decisions in the session. They might be thinking, okay, well, there's this building's on fire and there's a river right there, so with my rain ability, it's not exactly rain, it's river water, but maybe I could put together a pool, or I have a plot point, I'm going to make the localized rainstorm effortless SFX. Boom. Okay. The second SFX is mood SFX, and it is, quote, when pushing stress in a pool that includes an ability die, step up or double that ability die. Why, BW? What's the point there? I'll tell you what's the point there. I want players to not be afraid to take stress. That stress fuels their ability. So their ability die is a D8, but if they push stress, now remember, pushing stress is something that we do in Marvel Heroics sometimes. You take your stress die, you add it to the pool, and then after you roll, you step it up and put it back on your sheet. So if you have D6 mental stress and you can justify putting that in your pool for whatever it is you're doing, which usually you can justify them. There's only 3 kinds of stress, by the way, in this, and I skipped over it, but it's in parentheses. Just like Marvel Heroic, I have mental, physical, and emotional. So if you take that D6 mental stress and you put it in your pool, okay, and your pool has your D8 rain control, now you can either have 2 D8 rain control instead of that 1 D8, or you can take that D8 rain control and make it D10 rain control. But when you take that D6 mental stress, after you roll and you go to put it back on your sheet, it's not D6 anymore, it's D8. So, high pressure, it's in the name, use that stress to fuel your abilities. Okay. Then we have roles and then their domains. So there's a list of roles. I'm not going to read through all of them, but it's a set list that covers, again, pretty much everything that I would expect characters to be doing in a session. And remember also, and one of their distinctions is based on this, remember that, as we said in the beginning, these casters have roles in their settlements. They're not always going to be, constantly battling the elements, constantly doing whatever. Some days are just slow days and they're out in the field or they're teaching in the school or, whatever. They have a place, sort of their day job, right? They have a place in their community already. So some of the roles are going to reflect that as opposed to like the more sort of domestic or mundane or less fantastic kinds of things. But then they, of course, can be used in the fantastic kinds of things they're doing. And then I gave example abilities and some of their, domains that kind of loosely follow in that. And weather is pretty interesting. I remember looking it up, and it's pretty much wind and temperature and humidity. When you think of end of the world, I think we used the phrase ecopocalypse. I think I said that in the Discord, and it was like, ooh, I like that word. You might be thinking of like earthquakes, but earthquakes aren't really weather. They're tectonic plates, and the same is true. Even lightning is kind of pushing it, because is lightning weather? It's more like an effect of the weather, but it's kind of related. Again, this is the sort of free form. You come up with it, and maybe you have to work a little bit with your table, but and the same with the effortless SFX. Like, it works. Just do the cool things, right? Okay, and then I have a section on tips, which kind of explains some of the things that I've just said. But we have this idea of crisis pools, and crisis pools are essentially mini Doom pools. So we're using the Doom pool. You've seen that in the Marvel Heroic videos, but the Doom pool essentially starts out at a certain set. So usually it's like 3d6. As players roll hitches, one of the things the GM can do is give them a plot point and either add a d6 to the Doom pool or step up the lowest die in the Doom pool. So every time a player rolls a hitch, one of the things the GM can do, give them a plot point and make the Doom pool worse. And it's an ambient threat, but it's also a pacing mechanism, and it's a resource pool for the GM because the GM doesn't have plot points. So the GM would spend from the Doom pool to do some of the similar things that players would use plot points to do. And again, if you've seen the Marvel Heroic videos, you're a little bit more familiar with that. Even though every day I learn that I'm not very good with Marvel Heroic rules. Yes, just yesterday I learned of something that I was doing incorrectly still after, when was my first video? I think it's been almost a year since my first videos were up, and I look back on them and I see so many mistakes. But Cortex can handle mistakes. It's the perfect system if you're anything like me, because you really can't break it. It's very bendy, and you can stretch it to the limits, and you can be utterly clueless about core concepts and still have a great time at your table or alone in your YouTube videos. Okay, sorry. So crisis pools are like a mini Doom pool. They can be created from the Doom pool. You can actually take dice from the Doom pool and make it a crisis pool, but you can also set up crisis pools like ahead of time, like as you would a GMC or an NPC, right? So the idea of a crisis pool is, let's say, we'll use the same numbers as before. Let's say you have 3d6 crisis pool, and this represents a danger. So players each take an action on their turn. They take a test. They make a test to try to reduce the size of that crisis pool, which kind of is like you're putting out the forest fire or whatever it happens to be. It's kind of like a mob, kind of like a Doom pool. There's a lot of shades of nuance in there. But what I liked about crisis pools was They don't have SFX. I mean, I guess you could give them SFX, but they don't have other details. So they're very easy to create on the fly. If the session goes in a direction that you weren't planning, as the GM, you can just roll with it, and you can say, okay, I didn't have anything for this giant canyon. I wasn't expecting you to even try to cross it, but you all want to build a bridge or jump or do whatever to get across it. So it's rather perilous, but it's not too far across. Let's make it 2d8. So then when players have their turn, they each take a test against the crisis pool, and if they succeed, then that 2d8 starts to get stepped down based on their effect die, and if they fail, then they take stress. They take d6 stress. Right, because one of the previous rules was you take stress from failing a test against the crisis pool. So the idea would be they would winnow that crisis down, and narratively they're saying they're building a bridge, or they're trying to fill in the canyon somehow, or they're coming up with some kind of glider mechanism or whatever. They're using the narration, and they're doing these tests, and then when the crisis pool is finished, then they have completed their task. They've built the bridge, or they've figured out a way over the canyon. It's sort of a quick and easy GM tool, GM side solution. For me, anyway. I thought it would be pretty straightforward. So we use a lot of crisis pools. And then I talk about the mood SFX. I do have the bit, 1,000 years is not a long time, so play with that. It's like 1,000 comic book years or whatever. Like, it doesn't necessarily even mean 1,000 years from now. It might mean 1,000 years from 1,000 years from now. So in terms of like evolution and the different dangerous flora and fauna, you can lean into that and go overboard, even if it's unrealistic that there would be killer plants or something like that. Be inspired and run with it. Session records. I will read that because it pertains to not only this, but also, as I said, Sentinel Man is there, and I may have explained it poorly before. Session records are a great way to weave narratives and connect past events to present ones. A high-pressure session may be about a caster's personal growth that needs to be represented mechanically, and it might even focus on that. But more often, it's probably, in a high-pressure game, probably about discovery, navigating dangers, and wielding power as part of a community, extraordinary or otherwise, responsibly. So consider a series of high-pressure sessions, then, to be like a collection of short stories that take place in a shared world. Players may choose different characters for each session, and the GM may place them in drastically different locations or times. Individual growth of the casters with long session record lists is probably less important in these cases. And what I mean by that is, if you have 3 session records or 4 session records or however many it is, you can actually cache those in and increase your rating on something on your sheet. You level up, okay? It's like you're spending the XP. That is how session records work. But with what I had in mind, it's unlikely that you're going to have the same characters over and over and over again long enough to see that really taking effect. What's more likely to happen is those session records will stay there and get used like impromptu plot points, which is the other way that session records get used. And then just kind of over time, you'll have this maybe giant story that some people were playing in, and then weren't different sessions. Some people played in multiple sessions but played a different character every time. So it's really about the world that they've built, because they're spending those plot points to establish truths and things. Obviously, though, it could work long term. That's not a problem. It could definitely work that way. What I wanted to point out was that doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Okay, and then we talked about the mood SFX and really how that fuels abilities. There was a sort of a clarification that I had to make, and then the idea that GMs having pre-generated characters is not a bad idea, because then people can just take them and run with them. And then something I'll mention, which is not in the document, but is kind of an interesting session record thing. I was playing in another game. I wasn't the GM. And as part of my intro scene, I made reference to something, and the GM said, okay, everyone write that down on your session record. It was some kind of storm, doom storm or something like that. And so everyone had a session record to reference the fact that we as a team had actually experienced this other thing. We didn't play that session. It was just like a flashback reference, and I guess the GM liked it, or maybe they had this in mind to give someone this session record based on what they said. but everyone got put that on their sheet. So it was kind of cool. So if there's something that you need to guide players, if they know each other or something like that, you can throw a session record by default. You can say, all right, why doesn't everyone put, forged in the fires as their session record to just reference the first mission that they had, and then we'll spend 30 seconds apiece talking in character about what that was about, and then we'll move on with this session. And now you've got this little session record waiting to be spent, because plot points are going to be important, because you want to be taking and redistributing that stress and fueling your abilities with the pushing stress, which also means you're going to want to make sure you have time for the down scenes. The transition scenes is what we would call them in Marvel Heroic. In Cortex Prime they call them bridge scenes, but this is when you take your recovery actions and recover stress, hopefully, and shake off the complications if you've got any, that kind of stuff. And then we went right into example crises, and I did corrosive rainstorm 4d8, cyclone hurricane 5d8, wandering fronts 2d10. This is just me kind of spitballing the kinds of things that might show up in a high pressure session. And you'll notice I even put a mega quake on there because earthquakes are dramatic. You're not limited to weather stuff. You might even have raiders, which is the next section. Example, minor GMCs, mobs, and bosses. So I gave an actual minor GMC who was a caster and kind of described them. Then I gave a boss example. I gave a mob example with fog beasts. And then raiders, who might be desert raiders, they might be seacoast raiders. They're kind of the bandits, the pirates, the sort of stock and trade thugs that always do seem to make an appearance in these kinds of stories. So, call them whatever you need to call them that fits the climate they're in, but that's them. And then I have an example character sheet, and then thanks for reading, with a link to the Cortex RPG site or the Cortex RPG Discord. So I don't know that this was the best way to explain how Cortex worked. I don't think there is a way to explain how Cortex works without examples, though. So when I was going through this process, I was thinking I want to have some weather controlling abilities because that sounds cool, but I also want to make sure that characters have the opportunity to not be using them. So I need to make sure that my abilities aren't a prime set, and I know that I want to make sure that pools have at least 3 dice in them so that you can have 2 for your total and 1 for your effect, if not more. So I need to have 3 prime sets. I know I want distinctions, but I should probably structure the distinctions in a way that reflects something that has to do with what they do when they're not off saving the world or saving the community or saving the continent or saving the climate. So I want to make sure I have some occupation and some background, and then something that sums up the character. So that's where the motto or the catchphrase comes in. So I know I wanted distinctions. I know I wanted them to be structured, and I knew they were going to be a prime set. Roles, as I explained before, they cover a huge array of skills, and they dovetail well with the fact that these casters are a member of a community, and that's going to be always influencing their actions, and the attributes are always a part of what they're doing as well. So those are my prime sets. The abilities aren't a prime set, but are probably going to get used a lot. Signature assets, similarly, they're not a prime set, but they're probably going to get used a lot if they are chosen wisely. And then for how we grow, I didn't bother with milestones. I have a love-hate relationship with milestones. I used to just hate them. Now I appreciate them for who they are, and I respect them as an individual, but they're just not for me. At least not when I'm given free reign. I see where they work, and I can appreciate them in those contexts. But for what we're doing here, session records made more sense. And then, like I said, we used the Doom pool because I'm familiar with the Doom pool. It's a great mechanic. It's pretty straightforward. It sounds difficult to learn, but once you learn it, it's really just kind of like one weird thing that once you learn it, you learn it. And then the crisis pools are a pretty easy segue from the Doom pool line of thinking, and also a really good impromptu way of coming up with enemies, because for me, I struggle a lot with the impromptu thing when I have a crowd. When it's just me and I'm writing for Sentinel Man, as you well know if you've watched those videos, I could go on and on and on. But when I'm actually trying to play with other human beings, I try to be a little bit more organized and focused, and so sometimes I struggle with, well, I don't know how to handle that. Like, for instance, the canyon. I don't have a sheet for the canyon. Well, guess what? Just guess. Ballpark it. 3d8s. There we go. That's the crisis pool for the canyon. Is it supposed to be something that really stops the party? Make it 3d10. Was it something that they're just walking from point A to point B, and when they get to point B, they're going to have a big battle? Make it 2d6. Doesn't matter. You can, I mean, if it even has to be a crisis, right? Like, maybe you just say, good, you crossed the canyon. But if you want to make it an encounter with some teeth, some dice, you can just kind of come up with that number as a sliding scale for however long you want them in that scene, and for however long you want that threat to last, and you can just kind of make it up. And then the idea of stress, which I really love, and the idea of pushing stress, which I really love. And I remember I was actually doing dishes. I was downstairs doing the dishes, and I was noodling over this idea of, okay, I've got abilities, and at the time I only had them rated at D6. I was like, I have abilities, and I'm using stress, and I'm using the doom pool. What's the point here? And then I was like, well, BW, high pressure, really lean into that, and just encourage people to take the stress that they have and become even more stressed out, and let that sort of make their abilities even stronger. You know, they're really emotional, or they're really lashing out, or they're really hurting, you know, and that's informing and fueling the manifestation of their abilities. So I loved that, and I was like, that's the thing. So I immediately dried off my hands, came upstairs, typed out my notes, and then went backstairs and finished my dishes. I did make those new modifications a little bit, largely because they're things I've used before and I liked them, or because they really, I felt, fit well with what we're doing. And again, the idea that players can actively contribute and change the world is not something to look over. Like, oh yeah, BW, that's cool, and can't you kind of already do that with plot points? And I'm always listening to my players. Yeah. But maybe it's just me. I've played with some amazing players before, and amazing GMs, who come up with ideas that I never would have thought of. And I would hate to find myself in a situation as a player where I have a really great idea, but the GM, like, we're already moving through it, or we're already moving forward, or some really cool backstory idea, like, oh my goodness, I said my character was afraid of snakes, and I said they were born in the subcontinent. Maybe in the subcontinent, snakes are, 10 feet long, all of them, and they're poisonous. So then I can just throw some plot points out there and say, hey, hang on, we're headed to the subcontinent, and my character's afraid of snakes, and the reason is, boom, right? So I don't have to front load so much, and the GM doesn't have to front load so much. We can just come up with it on the fly. And of course, if you're using plot points, that means you're getting plot points. And if you're getting plot points, that means you're either rolling hitches, which can be exciting, or hindering your distinctions, which is also exciting. So it encourages that flow of plot points. Okay, that was the totality of the document, and the totality of the rules and the examples and the character sheet. High pressure. It's currently version 1.25. I imagine it's going to go through a lot of changes in once we get the playtesting going, but that was some glimpse into sort of my design philosophy and why I made the decisions that I made. Similar to the 10-in-1 game, it's not all of the games. It's not all the mods. It's not all the sets. But for this game, these are the mods and sets that I felt were appropriate, and yeah, I explained why. So we're going to do another fancy transition, and then we're going to wrap it all up. All right? Fancy transition! All right, and with that, we will bring the video to an end. As always, I will plug www.cortexrpg.com, and that will connect you to the Discord, where we are always hopping and happening, and it's a fun place to be. There are games that are run there on a semi-regular basis. It's a great place to ask questions, or even just connect with other folks and then go play a game somewhere else. The Fandom Tabletop YouTube channel is one to watch. They've done a number of series recently where they've basically gone through the entire process that I was reviewing with you today. They went through with some other folks, Melly and Cam, and then they had guests come on, and it was essentially, I want to make a setting that does this. And so they work together and they say, well, do we want to use this set? Do we want to use this mod? Does this work with this? And they kind of go back and forth, and they end up at the end of it, it's usually 2 videos. At the end of that series, mini-series, they have a finished product, and it's the whole creative process. So those are definitely worth a watch, and that channel is worth a watch for examples as well, like playthroughs and things like that. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. So if you have any questions, comments, observations, if you see something that I messed up somewhere, although it wasn't a gameplay video, so I think I'm safe. But usually when I think I'm safe is when I'm not. So if you noticed anything that I messed up, let me know and I'll put a clarification in the description. But other than that, thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned. There's some other videos coming. I don't know when all these things are scheduled to be uploaded or posted, but I do have other things coming up soon with Scott and some other guests, and that'll be a good time. All right, again, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it. Excelsior.